jam-packed couple of... No, that's fine. And you'll please excuse my title. I always like to have provocative titles, but I will actually tell you about some of the neuroscience work that we're doing at the end. So it's a little bit fun. And I should say that a lot of this work is done with my research group. So there's this weird thing in North America where a lot of people name their research group after themselves, which to me just feels super strange. So my research group, we're called the H-Naughts. And so that is the logo of my research group. Okay, so every talk on cosmology starts with a discussion about standard candles, which is great, except only women in their 30s and 40s are lighting candles in the dark. Most of us are looking at the headlamps of cars. And so I like, instead of talking about standard candles, to talk about standard headlamps. So this image was taken in New York City in 2012 when there was a huge blackout and there were no streetlights anywhere. And I like this image because it reminds us that if you're looking to jaywalk, which of course no one should ever do that, but if you are doing that and you want to cross the road, you use the brightness of the headlamps to tell you if it's safe to cross the road. But nobody ever told you that you actually should do 1/r² in your head. We just sort of all know how to do that if you grew up in the city at least. But it relies on a fundamental assumption that the headlamps in your car are equally intrinsically bright. And that's why you have to take your car every few years to be inspected to make sure that that brightness intrinsically remains. And if you know the intrinsic brightness, then you can use the apparent brightness to tell you how far away the car is. Anyone over the age of 2 or 3 who lives in a city just does that automatically. Of course, the cosmologists are saying, aha, we have budding cosmologists everywhere because we do the same thing in the sky. We use beautiful images of type 1a supernovae, and we calibrate them to enable us to measure distances. Now, if you want to find a lot of supernovae, you need a telescope that can survey the sky very fast. And then if you want to pinpoint the specifics of the supernova, you need a fantastic instrument like SAAO to help you really understand its spectrum and measure it. And so this is the Vera C. Rubin Observatory or telescope. Inside it, it's taken in the moonlight, which I really like in this image. A lot of telescope pictures are taken in the day, and of course, that's exactly how we do not use them. And the key thing about a telescope like Rubin is that it scans the sky very fast. So the image that you have in the top corner is the field of view of the Rubin telescope compared to, say, the size of the moon on the sky. And then the tiny little box that is zoomed in shows you the field of view of the Hubble Space Telescope. So Rubin will be able to scan the sky to great depths very frequently. And of course, what that means is that it will be able to take a picture of the sky every few days, the whole sky every few days. And so it will be able to find, not only add those images together and make deep maps of the sky, but subtract the images together and find things that are changing, transients, supernovae, white dwarfs, AGN, and it'll be able to find them. You know, the sky is glittering with objects. One of the predictions is that the Vera Rubin Observatory will detect 10,000 new objects every night. Many of those are going to be interesting to very different people. And it's this rapid scanning that will enable that science. And then, you know, enter the room a telescope that can not only tell us about the properties of these transients, because one of the key things about Rubin is that it will find a lot of these transients, but it will be able to take spectra of almost none of them. Well, none of them. It doesn't have a spectroscopic instrument. And so it relies on ground-based resources of other telescopes designed to really give you the fine understanding of the spectrum of these objects. Whoever took that photo, it looks very dramatic. In fact, this is an example. So SALT is already doing this. This is the dark energy survey, which can be thought of a little bit as an analog, at least in terms of the depth, to the Rubin Observatory. It's a little bit less, it doesn't do the whole sky, but it has similar depth in some areas. And you can see this is an example of a few years ago now, where SALT provided the real identification of what kind of object. In this case, it was a type 1a supernova. And typically, you use these objects then to do cosmology only if you know there are these standardized headlamps. They could just be a star exploding at any time in its life, and then it is less useful to tell you about the expansion of the universe and it's more useful to tell you about the inner workings of stars. One of the main things that enables Rubin to do some of its fast science is, of course, it has a 3,200 megapixel camera, and if you are making a camera, you need to have a man in a suit standing next to it to tell you how big it is. It's a very strange picture to me, because I don't know that many men that stand in suits next to cameras, but don't worry, it's now complete. And so now you can have 6 people standing also in suits, but with different poses to show you how big the camera is. So it's about the size of a small car, which is quite remarkable. And I was privileged enough to be at Stanford recently when they were testing the filter wheel. So the way Rubin works, it has 5 filters, and they sit on either ends of the telescope, on 5 sides of the telescope, and then they slip to the front and then move out. So there's a time associated with changing the filter of the telescope. One of the things that we're doing at SLAC was they were testing the filter changes, and I happened to be just getting a tour of the lab, and you'll excuse the audio, but
some variation in the process. Sure.
The red filter, which is why it's blocking out blue light, but really exciting to see Rubin go through the testing process, and it will be deployed and start commissioning in the next little while, and then operations a little bit after that, 2024. So what it will make, it will make a map of roughly the 14,000 square degrees of the sky that you can see from the deserts of Chile, and it will have a few different modes. It will first of all scan the whole sky and do a wide survey, and then it will have 5 deep fields where it's able to really integrate down to very good depths to give us a better understanding of calibration of things like photometric redshifts, and also allowing us to find really pristine supernovae. So these magnitudes are pretty amazing, the depths that it's going to go to, and there will be a ton of science. If you care about cosmology, you're going to get a wide field, which will give you a map of weak lensing of the sky and enable you to learn about overdensities and structure and how the universe is collapsing. And you'll get these 5 deep samples of supernovae. You'll also get discoveries of strong gravitational lenses and enable you to constrain things like the Hubble constant. And then you'll also be able to measure just galaxies all over that patch of sky and detect supernovae as well over the patch of sky. So what does that mean for supernova cosmology? Well, this is a diagram that was taken a couple of years ago now, which shows some sort of a compendium of all the observations of type 1a supernovae with time. Normally, you see a distance modulus where it looks like a curve. In this case, they've sort of subtracted out the sort of best fit cosmology, and so it looks like a straight line. And they're also showing the difference relative to that curve. And what you see is, first of all, there's a ton of different groups who have been making measurements across redshift range. So this x-axis is redshift, it goes from nearby to far away. The far away stuff is the Hubble Space Telescope, typically, because you want to look very deep. And then LSST, the survey that Rubin will generate, will give you about 400,000 supernovae in that intermediate redshift range between about 0.01 and about 0.8. Now, the key thing here is that the error bar, the sort of residual size, I want you to take a mental note of the size of this deviation. It's about plus or minus 0.5 of a magnitude away from the average. Those are sort of what the error bars are. And in a moment, we'll look at a forecast of what the survey will be from Rubin. But I wanted a little bit of a side note. So this is a slide I'm going to include in my talk on Friday. But my very first paper, written while I was a NAS honors student, was dealt with the question, if we get so many supernovae from Rubin or from LSST, what do we do if we can't take a spectrum of all of them? So for example, if I tell SALT we do nothing else, no other science except take spectra of the supernova that Rubin generates, and I tell every other large telescope on Earth to do that, we will still only manage to get spectra of a few % of the total sample. So there's no way we can rely on spectrum for everything. And so we asked the question in 2006, how do you do science in that world when you're not completely sure? And so this was from that paper that was was published, and we used the Bayesian method to separate out, to use the likelihood that you think a point is a supernova that's useful or is a different object, and we can kind of factor that all into some fun statistics to enable you to do cosmology. We then applied it to the Sloan survey at the time in 2012, and they didn't have that many supernovae, but we applied it, and I'm really pleased to see that my colleagues in the dark energy survey have now applied the beams approach, that's been improved in a few ways, to their main cosmological analysis. This paper came out just a couple of weeks ago. I'm not in the dark energy survey, but it's really nice to see this whole like start to finish analysis. And we will definitely use a beams-like approach in our big cosmology analysis with Rubin. Okay, so if ever you hear someone speak about dark energy, they are telling you something. They normally want to tell you about how dark energy might change with time. So instead of a cosmological constant, they say, what if it was changing with time? And they use two parameters. They use W naught, right here. W naught, which is basically what is the value of the dark energy equation of state today. We think about that as normally around -1, which tells you something about how it's, what is the expansion of the universe. And then we parameterize some redshift change. In this case, the parameterization is called WA. Basically, what is essentially the derivative or the term that encodes any redshift dependence. And the name of the game in cosmology is you want to remove your uncertainty in those parameters. So these are cosmological confidence contours, and anything that is inside the colored region, I can't tell the difference between two models, and that's bad. So we want this colored region to be as small as possible. In other words, I want to be able to tell the difference between two models, and so the smaller I can make the contour interval, the more likely I am to distinguish between two different models. So these are the constraints that we expect that Rubin will get by year 10, and you can see the black contours, which are the combination of everything, are teeny weeny. The official term is teeny. So what that means in terms of a plot that you've seen before is if I actually plot Hubble residuals in the same way that you saw before, that was half a magnitude up and down. This is 5 millimagnitudes up or down. So we've got 1,000 times better. And these two blue and orange curves are curves that are currently completely allowed within the cosmological framework, and they will be completely ruled out by our survey of supernovae with Rubin. If we can control for systematics, if we can do the analysis, of course, I'm being very optimistic here, but there's a lot of work we need to do in the next, 1, 2, 5, 10 years. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about what we do for the first step. So I mentioned to you that in something like beams, I want some understanding of whether or not a point is a supernova or not. Maybe it has a specific change in its light curve as a function of time, and I use that to distinguish, even without a spectrum, the probability that it is a type 1a supernovae or a full collapse supernovae or AGN or something else. And so one of the things we use machine learning for is to do that work. Can I classify objects into different bins? And in fact, if I think about what in general we use machine learning for in astronomy, as I get older, I like to make generalizations and put everything into categories. We typically use machine learning for finding something, detecting something, pulling out a signal from the noise, classifying things into different objects or applying labels to them, and then you can do kind of cosmological inference as well. In this case, this example here is from Galaxy Zoo, which was a survey from years ago where they asked users to classify galaxies into different types. There wasn't machine learning being used here, but this is a nice analogy for what that means when we classify things into different bins. And in fact, when it comes to transients, this is what we do as well. We take an image of the sky, the same patch of the sky in 2 different days or 5 different days, and we take the difference between those to get a light curve of the difference image. So how is the brightness of the difference changing with time? The reason why we take a difference is because we have a galaxy with a supernova in it, and we hope that the galaxy isn't changing that much with time. And so if I take a difference between yesterday and today, only thing left is the supernova. In reality, it's quite hard. Yes?
So Freudian.
Probably. That's very stupid to imagine. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's never as easy as this. Thank you. And then you can ask yourself, well, how do I take these light curves, take these different imaginings, and classify them? And you can do this 100 ways. You can say, I want to be principled. I have a spectrum or a template for how the different light curve would change. I know what type 1A supernova do. I know what white dwarfs do. I want to match it. Or you can say, I want to put as little of my knowledge in as possible. Let me just fit a template or a smooth Gaussian process interpolation, some curve, and just use those features to separate these objects into different labels. This, in fact, is something that one of my colleagues, Michelle Lochner, is a world expert in and has done a lot of work. So we started some of this together while she was a student, and now she's leading some of the charge internationally to do this work, to actually separate these objects into different types. And and you can cluster them if you knew the label in advance to train, or you can actually try to learn without knowing anything about the labels. Okay. And the reason why we started to work on this was in 2010, which to me feels like yesterday, but is a very long time ago. One of my colleagues who was getting ready to run the Dark Energy Survey said, we are worried that we won't, when the data flows, we won't know how to separate the objects into different classes. And so he decided to simulate the kind of sky that they would see, simulate the kind of catalogs that they would get. They only cared about cosmology, so they only really cared about separating type 1A supernovae from core collapse supernovae mainly. And so they ran a challenge. They called it the Supernova Photometric Classification Challenge, or SAAO, if you like acronyms. And we all participated. Lots of groups around the world participated. And one of our main complaints was that we were given a very small set of data to train our algorithms on, our machine learning algorithms. And then the data that we applied it to didn't look the same. And we said, well, it's not really a fair test. Whenever you go to write an exam and your prof gives you stuff you've never seen before, you're like, well, this isn't fair. My training did not prepare me for my testing. And I didn't do as well as I expected. So all of our algorithms didn't do as well because the training data and the testing data, they were not representative of each other. Now, let me tell you, if you go from being a student, when you write an exam that upsets you and you complain about it, as soon as you become a prof, you set an even harder exam that is even less representative, because you know that's how the real world works. We build telescopes that see new things expressly because we want to see new things. And so we can't expect the data to look the same. So cut to 2017, and I decided to run the challenge again. In this case, I gave it a more fun acronym. We call it the Photometric LSST Astronomical Time Series Classification Challenge, or PLAsTiCC. Don't make an acronym that is easily searchable for not your work. But anyway, we added 2 C's as a way to help. But in this case, we thought about the exact challenge we had, which is that the data were not representative. And we realized we had to make it worse, because this is a problem we had to solve. We couldn't just avoid it, which is what I had asked the people who made the first challenge to do. And we realized we couldn't do that. So we made an incredibly non-representative sample. And we also wanted to build community. So in the past, people running these challenges were cosmologists. They wanted to do their cosmology better. And we thought there are lots of people who care about the sky that Rubin is going to see. And they care about AGN and kilonovae and gravitational waves. And so we simulated a sample that had much more diversity of objects so that it would be useful to people who didn't care a hoot about cosmology. We also made the training and test sample very non-representative, both in number and in types. In fact, we gave 8,000 training data and 3 million test data. We made the data look very different. The kind that we said, okay, the training data is the kind of stuff we have now, which is well sampled and very detailed. And then the Rubin data includes a bunch of stuff that's poorly sampled that has big error bars. And we also played an extra trick. We said to people, in the training data, we're going to give you a certain number of type of objects. And in the test data, we're going to give you some objects that you've never seen before. We took very weird models from people, and we said, all we want you to do is tell us what is the probability that the object you're seeing right now you have never seen before? Because we wanted to try and encourage people to look for anomalies. And so we said, that'll be the class 99. Just tell us if you've seen this object before. And the nice thing about this is we decided to make it an open machine learning challenge. So instead of just focusing on astronomers, we put this challenge on Kaggle, which is a big platform owned by Google that actually makes data available to people all around the world to do the challenge. Kaggle was so excited that they gave us prize money, which is pretty wild. And so the winners at the time could win money to play the challenge. And we had 1,000 teams of people participate in the challenge, which was really quite extraordinary. And the data are still online. In fact, the Kaggle is still online. So even though you can't win anything anymore, you can still play the challenge and write a machine learning algorithm to test against this data. We've also released all the data and all the models on a different site so that people can actually just, if they care about these transients, just look at them. We had to simulate how to grade them. And so we decided to make a sort of matrix of how we thought people might guess the answer. So in this case, the x-axis is the class, the probability of the class you predict. So imagine I have 15 types of objects, 15 columns on the x-axis and 15 rows, where the y-axis is the true class. So if you did perfectly well, you get a score of 1 everywhere. So you have that diagonal line going down. You get a probability of 1 in all of those boxes, and you're not uncertain. If you have no idea, you just guess randomly, you'd have, say, an average probability of 0.5. Sometimes if you studying for an exam and you spot, you only study one question and you're really good at that question and really bad at everything else. We call that tunnel vision. So that's the only thing you care about. And it sounds like a joke, but sometimes, say, people who want to find kilonovae, they really just want to find these gravitational wave events. They don't care about anything else. So they become hyper-focused on finding those kinds of objects. So that is a perfectly acceptable thing to do. You could say I have cruise control, where I just guess C on every answer on every test, regardless of what I think. And then the more interesting cases are sometimes you get two objects confused. Either you say, oh, type 1a will look like a type 1bc, or they both are confused them both ways. And so we imagine that some people would have some combination of all of these different approaches. And so in order to test how well we could grade the answers, we also simulated some answers and wrote some code to evaluate the performance. And I show you this here. This was our metric. Basically, I take your answer, I take my answer, and I apply sort of like a least squares between them, weighted by some probability weighting. Like if I really want you to do well at finding kilonovae, I can boost up that score and decrease the score for some other objects. Cool. But the cool thing is that this is one of our random simulations of the ways you could perform, right? So it's a combination of all those little matrices we saw. And this is actually one of the real submissions. So you can see this was the winner of the challenge. And so the predicted class probability is here, goes from 0, which is 0 to 1. And the true class is given on the top. And you can see the winner did mostly okay. So we have dark blue in some places. Type 2s didn't do great. You really know what's going on. Everywhere that's white is just 0. He got some objects quite confused with one another. You also, what you notice here is that the other probability, he kind of had no idea. He's just sort of guessing. Okay, so what did we learn from the challenge? So we put out a results paper where we summarized all of the things that people did. And the biggest determinant for how well you do in a machine learning challenge is not the machine learning algorithm you use. It's how you understand your data. And in fact, how you deal with the problem that I've mentioned earlier, where the thing you trained on and the thing you test on look very different. So we call that data augmentation. And the winner of the challenge happened to be an astronomer, but we didn't know until the day before he won that he would win because the scores were fluctuating. But he understood how to do this augmentation pretty well. So the way data augmentation works, imagine you take an image of me and you want to classify you want to train a machine learning algorithm to classify me. If you just get a photo of me like this, you give the machine learning algorithm 1 point to classify from. But you could take a photo of me like this. You could take a photo of me at a little bit of an angle. You could take a photo of me upside down. You could take a photo of me in slightly different light. It's still me, but you're giving the machine learning a lot more ability to learn about me in different conditions. And so that, in that way, you've augmented your training data, even if you only take one photo and you distort it. You maybe change the angle, or you add more noise, or you take, you take away the bottom half of the image. And so this is what you could do. So if you have a certain light curve, you could make the error bars bigger. You could shift the redshift. You know what redshift does to an object. You could take away some observations. And that way you provide, with the same base characteristics, you provide more examples of the same object. And so Kyle did a really good job of augmentation. And as a result, he did a lot better, because machine learning algorithms are really only able to learn as much as you give them to train from. One of the other things we learned is that we expected people to come up with some uber machine learning algorithm that was pristine and beautiful. And I don't know why I thought that, because no one has ever answered an exam that way. You just do anything that works, right? And so what we found is that people combined a bunch of different approaches. And in this one, we put a tick about what machine learning procedure they used. So they either did some kind of decision trees, or they used neural networks. And what you'll see is that a lot of people have ticks in a lot of places. So they basically took a bunch of different things they knew about machine learning, made some Frankensteinian combination, and ran the challenge. No one said, I'm definitely going to use only one approach. Now, there's a little bit of a caveat to that. People were trying to work fast. So the challenge was only 2.5 months long. And so they had to do, they had to come up with the solution very fast. The actual training data and the test data that we provided online has been used by many papers who are following our principled approach. But just from the challenge itself, we didn't take any method and say, this must be the de facto standard now for our analysis. The other thing we learned is that people didn't really care about the object they'd never seen before in the challenge itself, which we were surprised by. But again, I think we were given them too many things to do at the same time, and they got stressed. Since then, people have used this data set again to find these anomalies. So that, yeah, that's interesting. Okay. So every challenge needs another challenge. One of the things that we found, if I show you this light curve, is you see it still looks like a light curve you have seen before. There's time on the x-axis, there's flux on the y-axis, and things, extend for many days. But what we realized is, if you think about how telescopes actually work, normally someone finds something and they send out an alert or a telegram, and then you say, please follow up this observation. It happens pretty quickly. I don't say, listen, take 6 months of observations and then tell me what you think you've seen, because resources are limited. And so we wanted to work with the brokers who actually ingest these alerts from Rubin. So we called the challenge the Extended LSST Astronomical Time Series Classification Challenge, or ELAsTiCC. And we changed the challenge in multiple ways. So even though the data are still public, it's more now used by the 7 brokers who will ingest the feed from Rubin and send out notifications either to different telescopes around the world, or will just give the answers of classification. So now instead of releasing a light curve, we're releasing Rubin alert packets. So we're actually releasing the stream of data, and we're including some of the information that Rubin will also include, including properties of the galaxy itself. So previously we didn't really give it, 3 nearest neighbors or an estimated star formation rate or anything like that. And so now we're releasing a lot more of that data. We're also putting some correlations between where the galaxy is and what type it is. So we know that supernovae sit in specific specific types of galaxies. We also know that photometric redshifts align with the overall structure. And in the past, we just didn't include that. So the challenge is much more expanded. We also, the community complained that our models were too simplistic, so we added a bunch of models. And so there will be extragalactic data and also galactic models in the challenge. And we'll release all of those models as well. The other thing that's really, I won't go into much detail here, but the cool thing is that it enables us to test how well these broker teams can handle the flux of data. So there will be 10 million alerts from Rubin every night. And so the people need to be able to handle just, one alert every 60 seconds. And, the analogy is that it's kind of like this. People talk about the fire hose, but they don't realize that, we're just willfully jumping into the fire hose and then also struggling to get up afterwards. And as an example, we have sort of tested for each broker how well they're doing, and the classification improves with time, but we need to make sure they do well right away. And so one way we can evaluate their performance is we can say, how many alerts do we send as a function of time to you? How long does it take you to figure out what it is? And then how long does it take you to give the answer back? Because those are multiple different things you can do in your algorithm. And so we're working with the team now to actually test that and figure out, why some brokers are struggling, etc. So this is still a work in progress, but we'll keep moving. The final thing I want to say on this topic is once you have these alerts and you have the Rubin data, we also need to test how we're going to go from actual images to actual cosmology, because all of the stuff I told you about assumes you do this perfect aperture photometry and everything is fine and it's great. But of course, you need to deal with real Rubin data to understand calibration of the standard stars and understanding the properties and the systematics of the images. And so we made a simulation of about 100 square degrees of Rubin-like sky. So this was a couple of years ago, and we added as many systematic effects as we could, including some of the telescope effects. And one of the postdocs who was at Duke University actually followed this. I love putting this pipeline diagram up because, wow, there is a lot of stuff you have to do, including calibrate the images and do all sorts of stuff, and understand what if you find things that are not supernovae at all. How do you handle that? What is your efficiency as a function of signal to noise? And so this is work that Bruno did to go all the way from the images themselves, and of course, because it is a simulation, so we simulated sky images and we knew the properties of the underlying cosmology, we could actually compare things, correctly, because it's all simulated, and we did great. The problem is, we essentially did 10 square degrees, and now we have to make sure we're ready to do hundreds of square degrees, and that will happen slowly as the Rubin data previews start launching. So our next steps, we continue to analyze how well people do at classifying objects. We want to understand what is the impact of the choices we make in classification all the way through to science, and then figure out how we can get things going. I'm speaking to a lot of experts in the room who have really followed telescopes from zero to hero, and there's a whole long periods of time where you have to reevaluate all the choices you make, and Rubin is just at the beginning phase of that. Right, so just to remind ourselves, these are the things we use machine learning and astronomy for: classification, detection, and inference. But one of the things I love about being a scientist is that you get to go to talks that are outside of your field. And that's what I did a couple of years ago. I was at a workshop where there were astronomers and biologists. And I put up something like this, and I talked about what do we do in astronomy with machine learning. And they told me a little bit about what do they do, what do they use machine learning for in biology. And turns out they also want to detect signals and classify them. So this image that you see here is an ultra high resolution image of a neuron. And those tiny flashes of light you can see are electrical activity in the brain. And I'll tell you a little bit more about this. They also want to try and segment things, so find the regions of these interesting areas in the brain, and find weird stuff that isn't a brain detection. So this is a microscope pixel being all wonky, but if you didn't know that, you might put it through your sample and start to make bad inferences of what's happening in the brain. So I did biology up until the end of grade 9. So this has been a wild experience for me. Turns out the amount of stuff I do not know about the body is huge. But let me tell you some cool stuff. So in your brain, in your neuron, you have these beautiful neurons, and the space between two of these kind of the ends of the neurons, the axons, there's a little gap called the synapse. And turns out, this is quite incredible to me, and maybe everybody knows this, but I was delighted. Electrical activity in your body is mediated by the release of calcium. Calcium is really important. That's why we all need to have enough calcium. But when you have synaptic activity, so when you have kind of electrical signals passing between these two ends of these axons in the synapse, there is a release of calcium. And so if you are a biologist and you want to see when this is happening, you take a culture of neurons and you add a dye that is sensitive to calcium. And then when electrical activity happens, there is literally a flash. In fact, sometimes one calcium can make another calcium get excited, and so you have calcium-induced calcium release. But basically, calcium is just zipping all over the place. And so when I gave a talk to my colleague about cosmology, I showed the cosmic web, and she said, "Why does your data look like my data?" So that's probably not for a discussion today. But we started to just talk about the kinds of things that we study. And so I initially noticed these dendrites, these filaments really look like some filaments I've seen in astronomy. And similarly, when I thought about finding these flashes of light, I thought, wow, if there's one thing astronomers can do, it's find a flash in the dark sky, right? And so we started thinking about what approaches we have that were in common. And I really like to stress in this part of the talk, the way we came to this was for me, it was easy because the idea of no dumb questions, I was like, I'm definitely going to ask dumb questions because I don't know anything about biology. But we just came together and just told the story of our analysis, not assuming that we're trying to impress somebody, but just trying to make the steps clear. And it was really amazing to see how we work, the things that came up. Okay, so they take hippocampal cultures. I should say that these researchers are mainly studying neurodegeneration. So when you have neurodegeneration, something like Parkinson's or ALS, the firing of those electrical signals is happening both at a different rate and also structurally, functionally, it's behaving differently. And they think one of the things that's amazing about this research is those changes in your brain happen well before any physical symptoms, because once you get physical motor symptoms, the disease has normally progressed quite long. And so the hope with this kind of research is that if you can find ways to detect this changes in activity early on, you can actually diagnose way earlier and provide treatment way earlier. The other thing I should say, a lot of this research does happen in mice, which was something that I had to deal with initially because some of the mice give their lives for this work. But the other thing that was amazing to me is that this work that I'm going to describe is done in vitro, which means they take the mouse brain and they put the neurons in a dish and then look at it. But some of the work that we are doing, we think is fast enough that will enable them to do this in vivo. Turns out I didn't know that this was possible, but they can cut a hole in your skull and put a glass window and you won't even notice.
If you're a mouse.
No, if you're a human or a mouse. I mean, they are only doing it in mice, but the same is true of humans. You can actually just cut a window and image mouse brains while they are alive. And what's amazing there, if you're a mouse, for example, if you hit the mouse's whiskers, a part of the brain fires that is different from if the mouse is running, for example. And so some of this work, they can, and that is very linked again to the motor neuron side of the degeneration. Okay, so what do? You take these cells, you put them in a culture, and then you want to find the calcium, and so you add a protein that is sensitive to calcium, which has a bunch of fantastically confusing names, and then you do high resolution STED microscopy. Another thing that's incredible, when in NASC, you do optics courses, and you think to yourself, if I'm not going to operate a telescope, why is this useful? Obviously, it's super useful. It's also very useful if you ever care about a microscope, because a microscope is just a telescope looking in the wrong direction. And they have 2 photons instead of thousands of photons, but still, it's basically the same. And so we shared this common language when we're talking about a point spirit function, and when we're understanding, kind of calibration, which was really great. So they do this high resolution microscopy. Oh, and this is sort of the analogy here, which where they sort of look at the synaptic response as a function of where in the brain it's happening and what the patterns are, and the patterns are different depending on what the mouse is doing. So this is sort of one part of the work that my colleagues care about. So how do they actually do this? Well, they take a movie, so they have the microscope taking data, and then they separate all the frames in time, and they do a brightness threshold where they take everything above a certain brightness as a transient. Now, I humbly thought we had a bunch of machine learning algorithms that we could give them. And then I started talking to my colleagues, and they have a bunch of fantastic machine learning algorithms that they're already using. They didn't need my machine learning expertise at all. The place we actually realized we could help was in the image analysis part. Because what they were doing here is just taking a brightness threshold, anything of a certain brightness, and kind of cutting it off. And in fact, they were using grad students to actually say, this is a transient, this is not a transient, right? So you can think of these images as kind of different images, and you look in each one, where are the flashes compared to before? So this is about 80 microns on each side, so very high resolution spatially, and also very high time resolution. So in this case, each of these is really fractions of a second, but each movie takes a lot of computational time just to process, and then it takes about an hour of a grad student's time. And so this is what they try to reduce. So right now they do manual annotation to make their training data, and then they run a machine learning to test. And we thought this is where we can help. So the first thing I thought is I was like, oh, I know filaments in astronomy. My colleagues work really hard to find and characterize them. So these are some H1 filaments in a paper that was made by Susan Clark and others, where they said, can we use the rolling Huff transform to find these filaments? And so we applied the rolling Huff transform to these images. So basically what the rolling Huff transform is imagine I say, I want to find a stick in the image, a bright stick in the image. So I take imaginary stick and I rotate it until the angle sort of matches up with whatever I see on the image. And then I say, okay, there's a stick of that length. I can also change the length. And so I do that for a bunch of different sticks and a bunch of different angles. And I can find a map of the dendrite. The key thing about the map of the dendrite is when I told you about difference image in astronomy, the assumption is the galaxy isn't really changing in brightness from day 1 to day 2. In the dendrites, they really are. Some of them are flashing along the dendrites. The noise in the image is very different as well. And so we knew that if we modeled the dendrites better, we could find these faint transients better. So we made a better mask of the sticks of the dendrites. And then we did, the simplest thing, inverse variance weighting across time. So instead of just making one image for the background, we computed a better average along the dendrites to find the average brightness. And that allowed us to do a much better job of finding these different images rather than just using the simple threshold. Yeah.
So the structure stays there, changes in brightness along the same.
That's a really good question. Partly the structure changes with time. Partly, of course, some faint sticks will only appear in some images. So you sort of have to do this a little bit of iteratively. But yes, if we take, depending on our rolling Huff transform sticks that we find, you then say, now let me have the mask be the same, but change the brightness along the dendrite time.
Oh,
yeah.
Could you just point out to us where clearly the event that's here in the middle right actually is in the when you do that with transients in the galaxy, you always think, once it's pointed out, you go back.
Yeah, that's the thing.
I'm not struggling to see where
So, I mean, so there's definitely one here that's changing. Oh, you think it's this one here? Oh, yeah, this is the background, right? So you should be looking at the difference in day.
Oh, that's for the left.
It's basically that minus that.
Yes, right. Sorry, I got it.
You can tell the experts in the room are like, got it. So for folks on the phone, it's this little buddy that is actually here. The weighted background is roughly the same. Thanks, Rita. And so the other thing that we did is we just applied, we tried different methods of finding transients, we did source extractor, we did the flood fill algorithm, and we optimized them. We actually, in the end, we used DB scan to find each pixel, or really it's a voxel because it's time and space. We found little clusters in that space. And then we, depending on how big they are and how correlated they are in time, we then determined that they were transients. And we can now compare this with their previous approach. So we called it AstroBeats because I love acronyms for things. And so one of the things that we found, so the first thing is on the graph here, as a function of video number, so the videos are just numbered, we can compute what is our recall and precision. How many objects are we finding that are true, that we should, and how many objects are we finding that are not true, or how many objects are we missing? And we not only beat their manual annotation, but we maybe naively also beat the machine learning algorithm trained on their manual annotation. So the next step, of course, is training our machine learning algorithm on AstroBeats. We also can start to think about, like, learn the objects that we are missing or finding that we shouldn't. So for example, what you see here is that we made in log brightness and log kind of size, we can figure out which are the objects that we are finding. And so typically we're finding big-ish, faint-ish objects more easily than previous algorithms. The other thing that's interesting is that we can now also we can separate our detections into real things or places where the microscope goes out of focus. So the microscope sometimes goes out of focus in a way that it shouldn't. And those are still interesting. They may still have transients in them, but you want to really understand the focus shift before you just decide any properties of the object. And so this is sort of ongoing work as we try to understand how we can help the folks studying these objects use the transients that they detect. I should tell you, it's kind of cool, the way that they check for the focus or the way that they try to calibrate. It's like, to me, one of the next advances I think we can give them is adaptive optics, because what they do is they measure a little bead, which tells them something about their point spread function. Like a bright bead next to, on the same image, but like next to this, because the calcium, so as the calcium is released, calcium diffuses through the medium. And so a point source with time would change in brightness, not because of the actual physicality, but just because the light is diffusing. In fact, initially what we wanted to do is make light curves of these objects. And I was super excited that we would learn something about transients, but I managed to just fit the diffusion coefficient of calcium. So I learned something, but not necessarily something new. The other cool thing is we can use this to go back to the grad students and the professors and say, we found some objects that we think are real. Could you have made a mistake? And in fact, this happened. So all of these points here, the dots and the stars, were new objects that we found. And we went back to the annotators and said, could you take another look? And everything that's a star, they said, actually, I probably missed it. And this is important because some folks have done studies that if you ask the same person on 2 different days, or you ask 2 different people, there's actually quite a large variance in what people think are transients. Partly because, unlike in a galaxy, there's a little bit of information, like, sorry, in a supernova, say, is there a galaxy or not? Or if it's a galactic transient, how close is it to the galactic plane? You have a little bit less information there because these transients can happen either on the dendrite or off the dendrite equally. And so this is, we think this is a way that we can help retrain the humans, which is another part of this. So what's next? This is super fun work. I'm really lucky. I have a graduate student who 2/3 of their time is doing computer vision and astronomy, classification, transient science, and then 1/3 of his time is doing this biological application. And our hope is, because we're so fast we've created an algorithm that's pretty fast, that we can actually start applying it to the in vivo data, because of course you really want to use as little you want to hurt the animals as little as possible. And so you really want to make sure before you do anything in vivo that you can make maximum use of the data. Another thing we want to do next is, in astronomy, we know as you make deeper images, things become blended together as you see further and further. Of course, that's sort of the same in biology, because depending on how thin your slice is, you still see different objects sort of superimposed. And we want to take some astronomy deep learning algorithms and apply them to this context. And finally, we're doing some anomaly detection. It was amazing to me how many things we do. You can essentially port over and ask yourselves, first of all, learn more about the methods that you're using to take back to astronomy, but also quite easily make progress in a new field. So I hope you have at least had thought something new today, whether it is about the sky or the brain. And I'm really excited to be talking to you, some of you today and some of you for the next couple of days. So thank you so much.
Thank you for the fantastic talk. Any question here and online both?
I can see folks if they have any questions.
I guess I'm wondering is there anything that stood out that you did from them that
Yeah, so some of the stuff they do, so they do a lot of this kind of generative network. So one of the things that is very different between us and biology is they don't simulate in the same way, because they have models of the brain that are very complicated and people don't use. And then my approach is like, let's do sticks and balls and fuzz, and like very simplistic. And so sometimes what they then do is they take a low resolution image and they develop these generative adversarial networks to make high resolution images out of that. And so I think we can combine our two approaches a little bit. The other thing that is very important to them is they do a lot of, they're really concentrating on explainability. So sometimes, not everyone, but sometimes people in astronomy use machine learning as a black box to learn something, and they're very concerned with what are we learning. So an example is during COVID, people were taking scans of lungs to determine if people had COVID or not. And they found this incredible prediction of people getting COVID. And then they realized, unfortunately, that in the image, the people who had COVID were going to a specific hospital. And so the machine learning was learning the label of the X-ray, not the actual physics of the lungs. And so there are different approaches where you can basically run your machine learning to say, what is the machine using to make its inference in this image or in this spectrum? They're very concerned with that. And so we have a new project that we're actually trying to apply to astronomy to say, can we do that with gravitational waves? Can we figure out what is what are the algorithms actually learning to make it explainable? Because I want to try and help the astronomy community, gain that piece that I learned from them. So, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah,
I think then
Yeah, so the question was on data augmentation. And so there are two ways that you can do the augmentation that I didn't really go over. So thanks for asking that question again. The first is you can just take your, say now you have an image, you would make it, change the noise properties. You can literally just flip it around. That is one way. If you have a light curve like this, throw away some data points and pick which ones you throw away at random. So you could do that 5 times or whatever. The other thing you can do is what is shown in the bottom 2 plots here. So imagine you take a light curve and then fit some parameters to it, like the time it takes to decay in brightness, or the time that the explosion happened or whatever. Once you have a lot of parameters for your training set, you can then make a lot of light curves drawing from an extended set of parameter space. So once you have a bunch of parameters, this is an example of host photometric redshift of the object or maximum flux in one of the bands, one of the filters. And so they had a distribution for 1As, type 2s, and 1AXs or whatever. And then they said, let me resample that distribution, making a lot of more objects, but following the same distributions of the parameter space, so that I keep the relative information about the samples the same. And then I make a bunch of fake light curves with these parameters. So those are 2 ways you can do the augmentation to help you. I think the fact that Kyle understood what redshift was, I didn't talk about this at all, but there was a chat board in this Kaggle contest, which I thought no one would use because you're competing with everybody. But actually there was a lot of information. It was very collegial, and you can still see the chat if you go to the website. And someone says, what is this redshift thing? What does it do? And then someone says, I figured it out. And then they all get better. So we watched the scores. They suddenly all got better. And they did this even though they knew they were competing against each other. The talking got less at the end, but they were still talking. And so, yeah, the people who understood this very well typically did better.
yes, Rachel.
So in not the game, but the actual challenge, which is classifying transients, the winner is going to be we can use the earlier analysis today.
Yeah, who can,
pass this at turning actual analysis today.
right. Right. So this,
How much is that? Actual, spectroscopy?
a really good question. So the question was like, how much will the performance on early data actually depend on, say, the spectroscopic confirmation or other things? And I think, so all of the brokers right now, they can train on ZTF, which is one survey that is going to have the speed, I think, of Rubin, but much shallower. They can also use any spectroscopic data, you know, from ground-based telescopes on other things. And they probably will. The first year of Rubin will actually be to make the templates. So, you know, the images of the galaxy that we hope are roughly constant. So that first year will be making the templates and then testing whether or not people can ingest the alerts. But we don't think people will be very good at classifying, because the sky, they don't have that much information about the sky will really look like until after about a year. But, you know, you can sort of see here, like, they're still not great. They're still only at about 60% correct classification for type 1A. And their early classification, which is what we really want, like, can you tell what it is within a couple of days or within a day or two, is still not great. So we hope that these simulations at least help them train. But you're right, the first few months, they will be training the algorithm, and then this spectroscopic confirmation will be essential. So I would say one of the biggest advantages is helping Rubin with that kind of spectral work in the early time. It will remain important, of course, but that early year or so where people are like testing and refining, I think will be very important.
Yes.
When is data?
Well, so the actual commissioning will start in late 2024. And then it's sort of weird. So the Rubin commissioning data is not public. I don't even get to see it, which is sad. But what they're going to do is they have these two things called the data previews. The first data preview will happen sort of in whatever, April-ish 25. And that will release a couple of nights of data, fully processed. And then the second data preview will release about a month of data. And that will come sort of maybe August of 25. That data will be public. But in terms of and then of course it's taking data. And then, so basically I'd say from like mid to late 25 is when it will be regularly taking data. I think the alerts will still struggle in the beginning just because, you know, everyone needs to learn. But I would say, yeah, if you know of any telescopes that have some time, that's good. I should also say, as I didn't really get into this, but I'm happy to talk about international data rights because I've negotiated this for Canada. I'm also part of the desk, so I sort of understand how we absorb contributions. But one of the things, so for all international partners like South Africa, there's a balance of things you can give. You can give people power, you can give telescope resources. And I should say right now that Rubin is going to solicit from people who are already international partners like South Africa. If you want to increase or change your contribution, they are going to accept that for a while. And in particular, they're asking the science collaborations what would be useful. And so I think there's a good game to play between like what telescope access is available and how it can be used. I think in this, I care about supernovae, but also I really care about photometric redshift calibration. And that is a huge thing that is, very essential for all of these kinds of studies. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff.
Okay, I think we are out of time. Is there any question online? We just have time maybe for one very quick question.
Thanks, Gideon.
Okay, just make it very quick.
So just wanted to know, you mentioned about this.
Oh, that's a really good question. I'm not a super expert on the brokers, but sort of very briefly, some folks have different kind of classification algorithms under the hood. Some are using different architectures. So for example, some folks are they're sending all the alerts via Google, like on web, web storage and doing classification there and then bringing them back. Others are running just locally on one machine. But some people are using different models to train. So some people are saying, I know what the light curves look like of all these objects, and they're building up a library. Some people say, I'm just going to use information from the image. So in that sense, there's variation there. And also, some places just developed, a country developed their own because they already run telescope scheduling. So there's sort of a wide range.
Okay, let's thank Renée again. Thank you everyone for attending.